In the winter of 2022, every coffee shop, diesel pump, and equipment lot in Graham County, Kansas, was telling the same story about farming modern acres. The story sounded a little different depending on whether it came from a dealer, a lender, or a man who had just traded into something with enough width to make his neighbors feel either admiration or quiet nausea. At the dealership the story was about efficiency. At the bank it was about labor, speed, and spreading fixed costs over more acres. At the co-op it was about timeliness, logistics, and the kind of certainty people always prefer to claim after a system has already priced them into dependency. But it was the same story all the way through. Real grain men did not farm like their grandfathers. They did not build seasons around lister furrows, odd planter attachments, shallow sweep work, and tools that looked as if they belonged in a black and white photograph beside a man smoking unfiltered cigarettes. That era was dead. It had died with mounted cultivators, checkbooks with 2 carbon copies, and counties small enough to remember horse names. Modern corn, even on Dryland, belonged to flat fields, precise openers, fertilizer programs, herbicide timing, and enough horsepower to make hesitation look unprofessional. The woman at the center of this story was named Nora Templeton, and by 2022 she had already spent 10 years learning that rural people are much more comfortable with a woman farmer when they can sort her into one clear explanation. If she is conservative, they can praise her caution. If she is bold, they can call her unusual. If she runs the books, they can admire her discipline. But if she starts pulling old methods out of family memory and making them answer to modern economics, people get unsettled. They do not know whether to call her practical, stubborn, backward, or dangerous. So they settle for the county favorite. They call her interesting until weather or bills force a clearer word. Nora farmed with her younger brother south of Hill City on Dryland corn, wheat, and grain sorghum acres their grandfather had pieced together through 40 years of dry years, good timing, and a temperament too suspicious of easy money to become fashionable. The Templeton farm sat on the kind of country western Kansas understands better than it talks about honestly. Broad enough to flatter careless optimism from the road, thin enough in the wrong places to punish it by July. The soil ranged from decent to deceptive. The better stretches could carry corn if spring moisture held and storms were kind. The lighter rises, if planted too aggressively or worked too often, became a public argument between ambition and evaporation. Every acre looked flat until you learned to read light on it. Then you saw the old truth. The land rose and fell just enough to move water the wrong way if a person forgot what a field does after the rain ends. Nora's grandfather, Ellis Templeton, had farmed the place through the 1950s and 1960s with methods that by 2022 most local people described as history, if they were being polite, and foolishness, if they were not. Ellis had listed corn into furrows on the drier quarters, using a lister planter that built small ridges and set seed in the lower moisture line. He worked shallow, not because he lacked horsepower, but because he believed too much stirred earth in western Kansas became a confession the first hot wind would read aloud. He cultivated for shape and moisture, not just weeds. He spoke, according to family memory, of making rain walk to the seed instead of forcing the seed to beg the surface for mercy. Men in town had laughed at some of that even in his own day. But Ellis cut crops when many louder men failed, and by the time everyone around him had fully embraced heavier tillage, flatter planting, and cleaner-looking spring ground, he was old enough that the county treated his methods as artifacts instead of arguments. After he died, the old lister planter went to the back of a machine shed and stayed there. Not rotting exactly. Just waiting under dust, mice, and the county's easy belief that whatever had worked for Ellis belonged to Ellis's years and could stay there. Nora had not planned to revive any of it. For a long time she was as modern in her habits as anyone else. She used the planter the county respected, worked the acres the way local consultants expected, and watched the farm's diesel bill climb year by year in the quiet, relentless way input costs always climb while men pretend it is temporary. She told herself the fuel burn was the cost of seriousness. The extra spring passes, the finishing work, the occasional corrective tillage after weather or ruts, the hauling between fields, the warming work to get Dryland acres looking planted instead of merely prepared for planting, all of it could be explained. The explanation sounded thinner after 2021, when diesel prices started rising with a kind of cruel determination that turned every ordinary trip across a field into a smaller financial argument. Then 2022 arrived and the price at the pump made even big operators go quiet for a few seconds before talking as if they had expected it. Nora began running the numbers harder. Not just the total bill. Per acre diesel burn by field and pass. Tractor hours. Fuel use for tillage sequences on Dryland corn compared to final yield stability. She did not like what she saw. Some of their worst, driest acres were carrying the biggest spring fuel burden, not because they produced the most, but because they resisted current methods hardest. One rough quarter west of the highway, called the Sand Creek 120, was the clearest offender. Every year it consumed time, diesel, and emotional energy out of proportion to its reliability. It needed enough preparation to look respectable. Then if June and July turned mean, it often rewarded the work by behaving like a thin animal fed too late. At the same time, she found her grandfather's field notebooks. They were in a cedar trunk in the machine shed office beneath tax folders and old auction bills, and at first she opened them only because winter makes farmers rummage in the past when the present will not move. But Ellis's notes were not nostalgic. They were technical in the old way, meaning the conclusions came from fields rather than conferences. Listing dates. Furrow depth. Moisture at seed placement. Diesel used per field in gallons, not just dollars. Number of trips avoided by combining operations. Notes on wind after planting. Notes on how listed ridges handled scattered half-inch rains in June compared to flat-ground planted checks. Notes on summer cultivation as moisture shaping, not merely weed control. The notebooks did not claim a miracle. They claimed economy. One line from 1957 caught her hardest. Dry corn year. Listed west quarter. One full trip less than neighbors. Yield not much better. Fuel bill enough better to matter. That line would not have changed the farm by itself. But line after line said versions of the same thing. Ellis had not been worshipping old methods. He had been answering western Kansas with a system built for thin moisture and expensive movement. In 2022, with diesel prices biting and the Sand Creek 120 still punishing them, Nora began to suspect her grandfather had not died out of date. He had simply died before fuel prices and Dryland fragility brought his logic back within reach. Her brother Caleb hated the idea from the start. Caleb was 36, hardworking, mechanically sharp, and old enough to know how county ridicule can become operational drag if you give it too many easy shapes to latch onto. He respected Ellis. Everybody in the family did. But respect for a grandfather and trust in his machinery are not the same thing. "You are not seriously thinking about listing corn," he said one February night after Nora laid the notebooks on the table. Nora answered, "I'm thinking about the fuel bill." Caleb laughed once without humor. Then buy less coffee and quit reading dead men. She slid one notebook toward him. He tracked gallons by field. That was the 50s. Diesel still burned then. He looked down at the notebook but did not pick it up. "The county will say we've lost our minds." Nora looked straight at him. "The county isn't paying our fuel bill." That ended the first round, but not the argument. It flared again when she dragged the old lister planter attachment out from the back shed in March. The machine itself looked like county mockery made physical. Rusted but not ruined. Furrow openers heavy enough to belong to a time when steel still believed in itself. Marker arms that looked theatrical to anyone raised on guidance. Depth mechanism stiff but salvageable. Ellis's old notes even had row spacing and sweet measurements tucked into the lid of a wooden seed box. Nora did not intend to restore the whole machine in some sentimental pageant. She intended to adapt the method. Use modern seed metering where needed, combine the Lister shovels with a narrower modified toolbar and planter units they trusted, and build a system that shaped the field like her grandfather's method without pretending 2022 had never happened. That was when the county truly noticed. A neighbor named Todd Branscombe drove by and saw the old Lister out in the yard and stopped just to make sure his eyes were not insulting him falsely. "What in God's name is that for?" he asked. Nora said, "Dryland corn." Todd laughed so hard he had to brace one hand on the pickup door. "That thing died before my dad got out of diapers." "Maybe your dad missed something." Todd shook his head. "Or maybe you spent too much winter with old notebooks." That line spread faster than fuel prices. At the co-op, men started referring to the Templetons' museum planter. A parts salesman asked whether Nora planned to wear pearl snaps and bring back Checkro wires while she was at it. The local agronomist, who was competent enough to know better but public enough to protect his own dignity, said the method had historic interest, but no place on modern acres where stand uniformity and timely planting mattered. One banker asked Caleb privately if his sister was under too much pressure from fuel costs, which is a beautiful example of how counties confuse creativity with stress right up until it works. Nora rebuilt the system anyway. She and Caleb spent 10 days combining old iron with newer components. The Lister shovels were cleaned, squared, and mounted ahead of adapted planter units. The seed delivery was modernized enough that population and drop remained trustworthy. A lightweight guidance aid helped keep the old geometry from turning into chaos. The whole setup looked strange, which was exactly the problem. County people can ignore ideas they do not understand until the ideas attach themselves to visible machinery. Then they become personal. The Sand Creek 120 was the chosen field because it was both vulnerable and honest. It had enough slope and dryness that flat planting often left the crop exposed too early. It had enough historical underperformance that Nora could experiment without risking the whole farm. And, crucially, it consumed too much diesel under the current system for anyone paying real attention to keep defending it casually. Her plan was simple in the best sense. One shallow pre-pass only where needed to manage winter roughness. Then list and plant in one operation, using the furrow to place seed where moisture remained more available and the ridged shape to catch whatever scattered rain summer might still offer. Later, if needed, one cultivation pass timed for weed pressure and shape maintenance. Fewer trips. Less fuel. More field structure doing the work instead of horsepower. Spring weather helped just enough to keep everybody honest. March ended dry. April warmed unevenly. The county got into the fields with the usual anxious professionalism, stirring, leveling, blackening, and speaking about good starts. Nora waited longer on the Sand Creek 120 than Todd Branscombe said was sane, because she was planting moisture, not calendar. When she finally ran the modified Lister planter across the first field edge, the result looked exactly wrong to the county eye. Furrows. Ridges. Uneven-looking surface shadows. Not a flat, clean, conference-approved seedbed, but an old geometry returned to a county that had spent 60 years trying to forget it. Todd came by twice that day. The first time he laughed. The second time he just stared. Caleb drove the tender truck and said very little. The more the system worked mechanically, the less appetite he had for public skepticism. Nora checked depth constantly, adjusted shovel pitch, and made the kind of calm corrections only possible when a farmer is answering a field instead of a watching county. By the end of the second day, the Sand Creek 120 was planted. Not quickly by modern bragging standards. Efficiently by the standards that would matter most later. They had made one shaping and planting pass where other farms on comparable ground had already burned fuel through multiple trips to achieve a prettier beginning. The county's favorite joke then was that Nora's corn would have to climb out of the 1950s before it reached sunlight. June muted the laughter but did not kill it. The crop emerged a little differently. Not worse. Differently. The listed rows held moisture better in the lower seed zone. Early growth looked less dramatic from the road because the ridged profile changed how shadows fell and how county eyes read seriousness. Men like Todd interpreted any deviation from flat emergence aesthetics as proof of error. The agronomist walked the field once and admitted the stand was better than expected while immediately adding that modern hybrids preferred more uniform surface conditions. Nora asked him whether the hybrids had expressed a written preference or whether he was speaking for them. He did not appreciate the question. But the field itself kept answering. The furrowed rows preserved early moisture longer into warm afternoons. The ridges broke wind differently. Small rains that in previous years would have flashed off and vanished instead worked their way toward the lower seed zone and lingered there. Not in abundance. Never abundance. Just in slightly better timing and slightly longer availability. The kind of difference counties do not respect until July turns them into hierarchy. And July did exactly that. The month came in hot and stayed committed. Highs in the 90s. Warm nights. Long, thirsty wind. Western Kansas knows that weather better than it wants to discuss because such weather does not merely test crops. It reveals the lie inside whatever spring confidence men have purchased. By the second week of July, the county's dryland corn was dividing into two classes. Fields that still had a little stored patience and fields that had already spent too much of it in May and June. Flat-planted corn on lighter ground began rolling earlier in the day. The road view differences appeared first as posture, then color, then silence where local optimism had once been noisy. The Sand Creek 120 should have been in the second class. It had always belonged there. Instead it held in the first. Not lush. Not boasting. But holding. The listed furrows had given roots a cooler line to follow. The ridges had caught and directed those stingy June rains more effectively than the county's flatter seedbeds on comparable ground. The one cultivation pass Nora made in time had controlled weeds while preserving the field shape that now mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. By noon the field still rolled some, because every dryland corn field in Graham County rolls under enough July heat. But it rolled later and recovered sooner. That is the sort of difference that becomes money only after the season has already chosen its victims. Caleb saw it before he admitted it. He drove from the Templeton Upland Quarter to the Sand Creek field one afternoon when the wind was hot enough to make the whole county look slightly powdered. Todd Branscom's flat-planted field across the road was already showing the kind of rolling and lower firing that farmers later call weather-related, as if the phrasing lessens their own role in the conversation. Nora's listed field looked odd, old-fashioned, and still very much in the fight. Caleb got out, walked a few rows, then called Nora. "You need to come look," he said. She laughed lightly. "I've been looking." "No," he said. "I mean really look." When she got there, he was standing on the west edge with both hands on his hips, staring across the furrowed field like a man watching a wrong idea refuse to behave. "It shouldn't be this much different," he said. Nora looked across at Todd's field and then back at theirs. "That's what the county keeps saying." The county ran out of easy mockery that same week. Men still joked, but the tone had changed. Now the jokes sounded defensive. At the co-op, someone said Nora's listed corn only looked good because the ridges were playing tricks with shadow. Another said the difference would disappear once the ears filled. A third said fuel savings meant nothing if the yield fell apart. All of that would have been more convincing if the fuel board in Nora's office had not already begun to show what the year was doing. She tracked diesel by field with the same discipline Ellis had, and by mid-July the Sand Creek 120 had used significantly less fuel per acre than comparable corn on the farm had used under their old sequence. Fewer spring trips. Less corrective work. Less movement disguised as professionalism. The fuel bill was already starting to say what the county did not want to hear. Then the weather held hot through pollination. That was the true test. If the listed method merely saved fuel and produced a weak crop, the county would still win the story. People forgive inefficiency more readily than they forgive visible failure. But the Templeton field pollinated better than expected because it had entered the critical stretch with less accumulated stress and slightly better moisture position in the root zone. Again, no miracles. Just a field no longer beginning every hard period already half exhausted by its own preparation. Todd Branscombe came by in late July at dusk and stood on the tinrow long enough to make his intention obvious. "Your grandfather really farmed this way?" he asked. Nora nodded. "On the drier quarters." Todd looked out over the furrow lines, now subtler under a taller crop but still there if a person cared to see them. "My dad said listing died because nobody wanted to fool with it. Maybe because fuel got cheap enough to hide the difference." Todd laughed once, but not against her. "Ain't cheap now." "No." He kicked at the soil where the furrow met ridge. "You think this is about old methods?" Nora answered, "I think it's about old questions. How many trips does a field really need? Where does the water go? What does your fuel buy besides appearance?" That was too sharp for Todd to dismiss and too true for him to enjoy. Harvest settled it the only way counties truly learn. Not through explanation. Through receipts. The Sand Creek 120 did not become the best field on the Templeton farm. That would have made people suspicious, and rightly so. The better, deeper quarter east of the house still beat it. Some irrigated acres elsewhere in the county beat them all. But compared to the Dryland fields people actually compared with one another, the lighter, vulnerable, fuel-hungry acres that had to justify themselves honestly, the listed field came in stronger than it had any right to in the county's judgment. The yield held where comparable flat-planted fields had faded. The field's weak spots remained, but less brutally. And when Nora laid the grain receipts beside the diesel log, the real argument came into focus. The fuel bill on the Sand Creek 120 was dramatically lower. Not a cute saving. Not an anecdotal difference swallowed by one repair invoice. A real, field-scale reduction in diesel use per acre on a year when fuel prices had made every gallon feel personal. She showed the numbers first to Caleb, then to her mother, then eventually to the lender who had worried in spring that the Templetons were drifting into eccentricity. The field had not only survived. It had survived cheaper, in exactly the category everyone had dismissed as backward. Caleb stared at the board in the office and said, "If we'd flat-planted that quarter the old way, we'd be under this yield and over this fuel." Nora nodded. "That's what Granddad kept writing." "What else did he write?" She smiled for the first time in days. "Enough to bother the county." The lender, to his credit, saw it immediately. He ran a finger down the per-acre fuel column, looked at the yield sheets, then said, "People mocked this?" Nora said, "All spring." He tapped the diesel total again. "They might want to mock quieter now." By winter, they did. The agronomist reframed his view first, the way professionals always do when evidence arrives with inconvenient timing. He began talking about field-specific moisture-shaping approaches and revisiting historical dryland geometry under high fuel environments. That language did useful work for him because it turned Nora's grandfather's method into a concept rather than an embarrassment. Todd Branscombe asked if he could come look at the old Lister attachment. A younger farmer from Penokee asked what row-width Ellis had used. Caleb, who had once called the whole thing county suicide under a different name, started searching auction listings for old Lister toolbars before prices could rise on reputation alone. Nora did not become a preacher of antique agriculture. She remained more careful than that. She knew the method would not belong on every acre. She knew some years the timing would go wrong, some fields would refuse the geometry, and some operators would misuse the system badly enough to make old critics feel justified again. She never claimed her grandfather had been right about everything. Farming punishes hero worship almost as quickly as vanity. What she claimed, quietly and with the stubborn patience that made county people uneasy, was smaller and harder to dismiss. Her grandfather had been answering a field, not a fashion. And in 2022, with fuel expensive, moisture thin, and the county's favorite modern assumptions suddenly costing more than they delivered on certain ground, that answer had become relevant again. At the winter meeting in Hill City, a dealer who had laughed too freely in April asked Nora whether she thought the county had abandoned old methods too quickly. She answered with the sentence Ellis might have liked best out of everything she said that year. "I think the county stopped asking what those methods were saving. That was the whole story, really. The county had treated the old Lister system as crude because it did not look like progress." But Ellis Templeton had never been farming for appearance. He had been farming for diesel, moisture, field position, and summer survival on acres that could not afford repeated mechanical persuasion. Nora had revived the method not because she wanted to live in the past, but because the fuel bill and the Sand Creek 120 had cornered her into asking a better question than the county was asking. Not what looks modern. What pays? They said her grandfather's method died in the 1950s. Then the fuel bill proved otherwise. And once the county saw a Dryland corn field hold its dignity through July while burning fewer gallons getting there, they had to admit that some methods do not really die. They just wait for conditions honest enough to make people hear them again.